They buried it, pulled it off the schedule, locked it away, and pretended it had never existed. For decades, one episode of the iconic sitcom Married with Children lived in television limbo. It had been written, filmed, edited, and fully ready to air. The cast had performed it. The network had approved it. The audience was supposed to see it. And then, suddenly, it vanished. No announcement, no explanation, just silence. The episode disappeared so completely that many fans began to wonder if it had ever existed at all. But it did. And the story behind why it was hidden says a lot about television, censorship, and a moment in history when one sitcom pushed the boundaries a little too far. So, what exactly happened? Why did a show famous for outrageous jokes suddenly cross a line that even television executives refuse to tolerate? And why, after more than 30 years, is this lost episode finally returning to the spotlight? To understand that mystery, you have to go back to a time when television looked very different. In the late 1980s, American television followed a comfortable formula. Most sitcoms were built around wholesome families learning gentle life lessons. Every episode ended with hugs, understanding, and a neatly resolved problem. Shows like Full House, The Cosby Show, and Family Ties dominated primetime television. They were warm, optimistic, and safe. But audiences were beginning to crave something different. That's when a new show arrived and shattered the formula entirely. When Married with Children premiered in 1987, it felt like a rebellion against everything television comedy had been before. Instead of a loving family navigating life's challenges, viewers met the Bundys. At the center of the chaos was Al Bundy, a miserable shoe salesman who hated his job, complained about his life, and spent most of his time reminiscing about the one moment he felt successful, scoring 4 touchdowns in a high school football game. His wife, Peggy Bundy, was nothing like the supportive sitcom mothers audiences were used to. Peg avoided housework, loved shopping, and preferred watching television to cooking dinner. Their children weren't sweet or inspiring either. They were lazy, sarcastic, and often just as selfish as their parents. And that was exactly the point. The show didn't pretend families were perfect. Instead, it leaned into dysfunction, frustration, and brutally honest humor. There were no moral lessons, no sentimental endings, just biting jokes and exaggerated misery. Surprisingly, audiences loved it. The show quickly became one of the most talked about sitcoms on television. But that success came with a price. Because the same humor that made the show popular also made it incredibly controversial. From the very beginning, Married with Children pushed the limits of what television networks considered acceptable. The jokes were crude, the insults were relentless, and the show mocked almost everyone. Nothing was sacred. The characters made fun of themselves, their neighbors, their families, and often society itself. For viewers who were tired of overly wholesome sitcoms, it felt refreshing. For critics and watchdog groups, it felt dangerous. Religious organizations and conservative commentators began to criticize the show almost immediately. They accused it of promoting immoral behavior and degrading traditional family values. Even politicians occasionally pointed to the show as evidence that television was becoming too vulgar. Inside the network, executives walked a constant tightrope. They wanted the ratings the show brought in, but they also had to deal with advertisers who worried about being associated with controversial content. Scripts were frequently reviewed. Jokes were sometimes rewritten. And occasionally entire scenes were cut. Still, week after week, the show continued pushing boundaries. Until one episode finally pushed too far. The episode was called I'll See You in Court. At first glance, it seemed like a typical storyline for the Bundy family. Al and Peg decide their marriage needs a spark. So they book a night at a rundown motel, hoping a cheap getaway might revive their romance. Of course, nothing about the Bundys' lives ever goes smoothly. After their awkward attempt at romance, they discover something disturbing. The motel has been secretly recording its guests. Hidden cameras captured everything that happened in the room. And those recordings may have been viewed by strangers. Furious and humiliated, Al and Peg decide to sue the motel. But when the case reaches court, things become even more ridiculous. They discover they weren't the only victims. Their neighbors had been recorded too. What follows is a chaotic courtroom spectacle filled with embarrassing testimony and uncomfortable jokes. By the standards of the show, it was outrageous, but not unusual. At least, that's what the cast and crew believed. But when the episode reached network executives, alarm bells started ringing. The late 1980s were a very different time for television. Broadcast networks relied heavily on advertisers, and advertisers were extremely sensitive to controversy. The idea of secretly filming couples during intimate moments raised serious concerns. It wasn't just a comedic storyline. It touched on issues of privacy, consent, and exploitation. Topics that sitcoms rarely approached. Executives worried that audiences might find the subject disturbing rather than funny. More importantly, advertisers might pull their sponsorship, and the network couldn't afford that risk. The situation became even more complicated when a public controversy erupted around the show itself. Around the same time the episode was scheduled to air, one viewer launched a campaign that shook the entire television industry. Her name was Terry Rakolta. Rakolta was a Michigan mother who happened to see an episode of the show while her children were watching television. She was outraged. She believed the show was offensive, crude, and harmful to families. But instead of simply changing the channel, she took action. Rakolta began writing letters to advertisers. She urged companies to stop sponsoring the show. Surprisingly, the campaign worked. Major corporations began reconsidering their advertising deals. Some companies quietly withdrew their sponsorship entirely. Suddenly, what had been just another controversial sitcom became a national debate. News outlets began covering the story. Commentators discussed whether television had gone too far. And the network found itself in the middle of a growing cultural battle. That's when executives took another look at the upcoming episode. The episode about secretly recorded motel guests now looked like a potential disaster. Advertisers were already nervous. Public criticism was growing, and the network was still trying to establish itself as a serious competitor in the television industry. Air the episode, and the backlash might intensify. Pull it, and the controversy might fade. The decision was made quietly. "I'll see you in court" was removed from the broadcast schedule. No official explanation was given. The episode simply disappeared. It wasn't included in reruns. It wasn't released on home video. And for years, it wasn't even mentioned in official episode lists. To the public, it was as if the episode had never existed. Inside the production team, the reaction was mostly confusion. The cast had performed far more outrageous jokes before. The actor who played Al Bundy, Ed O'Neill, later said he couldn't understand why this particular episode caused such alarm. The show had already aired jokes about sexuality, marriage, and personal humiliation. Why was this storyline suddenly unacceptable? The actress behind Peggy Bundy, Katie Sagal, reportedly thought the episode fit perfectly within the show's style. In her view, the absurdity of the situation captured exactly what the Bundy marriage was about: awkward, uncomfortable, and hilariously dysfunctional. To the writers and producers, it was just another episode. But outside the studio, the political and cultural climate had shifted, and that made all the difference. As the years passed, rumors about the missing episode began to spread among fans. Some people believed the episode had been destroyed. Others claimed it had aired overseas. A few insisted they had seen it late at night somewhere on cable television. But no one could confirm the truth. Without official releases, the episode became something of a television ghost story, a lost piece of sitcom history, and the mystery only made people more curious. More than a decade later, something unexpected happened. A cable network called FX had acquired the rights to broadcast old episodes of the show. During one of their marathon reruns, they quietly included the missing episode. No special announcement, no marketing campaign, just another episode in the schedule. But longtime fans immediately noticed something unusual. They were watching the episode that had vanished years earlier. The lost episode had finally aired in the United States. Online message boards exploded with excitement. People debated whether it was really the infamous banned episode. Others rushed to record it before it disappeared again. And just like that, the legend was confirmed. The episode had been real all along. When viewers finally saw the episode, many were surprised. By modern standards, it didn't seem nearly as shocking as people expected. The jokes were crude, but typical of the show. The plot was ridiculous, but clearly meant to be comedic. What had once terrified network executives now felt relatively tame. But that difference revealed something important. Television had changed, and so had audiences. By the early 2000s, television storytelling had become far more daring. Cable networks were producing shows that explored darker themes and complex characters. Series like The Sopranos, South Park, and Nip/Tuck were pushing boundaries that broadcast networks had once considered impossible. Later, streaming platforms like Netflix and Amazon Prime Video would take those boundaries even further. Audiences were now used to stories involving complex moral questions, explicit humor, and controversial subjects. Compared to those shows, the once banned sitcom episode seemed almost innocent. What had changed wasn't the episode. It was the culture surrounding it. Looking back, the episode wasn't just controversial because of crude jokes. It touched on something deeper. The story dealt with privacy, surveillance, and the humiliation of having personal moments exposed without consent. In the late 1980s, those ideas felt uncomfortable and unfamiliar. Today, they feel incredibly relevant. We live in a world filled with cameras, smartphones, and constant digital recording. Private moments can become public in seconds. Stories about leaked videos, hacked photos, and online humiliation appear in headlines regularly. In that sense, the episode feels strangely prophetic. What once seemed outrageous now feels like a dark reflection of modern reality. And that's why people are still talking about it decades later. Today, the once buried episode is no longer hidden. It's discussed openly by fans and television historians. What was once considered too controversial for broadcast has become an interesting artifact of television history. It reminds us how quickly cultural standards can change, and how stories that once seemed dangerous can later become valuable conversations about the past. The episode that networks tried to erase didn't disappear after all. It survived through curiosity, persistence, and the simple fact that audiences never stopped asking questions. And sometimes the stories that are hidden the longest become the ones people want to see the most.